Nigeria faced an act of terrorism so brutal.
Militants from Boko Haram have laid siege on villages in the north.
Local government officials says more than 2,000 people may have been massacred.
Could be the deadliest attack.
The military is disputing the casualties.
Looking around Baga to check exactly what's happening, so it's hard to be sure we're getting facts.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media developments that we've been tracking this week. A horror story in Nigeria that's a nightmare to report on. Boko Haram shuts down the coverage. The Charlie Hebdo story, as seen through the eyes of cartoonists in Africa, South America, Europe, and the US. Edward Snowden still feeding surveillance stories to The Guardian, still making news. Paris has been in the headlines for the past couple of weeks, and chances are you haven't even heard of another dateline, Baga, which has seen far more bloodshed than the French capital. Baga is in northeastern Nigeria. It's been under constant attack ever since January 3rd by the militant group Boko Haram. The death toll varies depending on the source. Some news organizations put it as high as 2,000. The Nigerian military has it at about 150. And that encapsulates the problem with covering this story. Very little is verifiable because much of that corner of the country is under Boko Haram's control. Our only real window into the devastation comes from satellite imagery because the region is inaccessible to the authorities, let alone the media. The internet is also inaccessible. Mobile phones haven't worked there for months, so social media has no way to report what is happening. Northeastern Nigeria is a black hole for information, which is one of the reasons why this story is not getting the coverage it deserves. Another, according to his critics, is the government of President Goodluck Jonathan, who has an election to fight, doesn't want Boko Haram setting the agenda, and therefore doesn't want to spend time talking to journalists about the group. Our starting point this week is the capital, Abuja.
It took Boko Haram 17 days to make a claim most everyone knew was coming, that it was responsible for the carnage in Baga. What we still do not know, more than 3 weeks after the killing spree began, is how many have perished. And it boils down to the most fundamental of journalistic requirements: access.
We need to understand how the media industry works in Nigeria. A majority of them are operating out of Lagos. So the point remains that most of them do not have operations outside of Lagos. You understand that Boko Haram is in the remotest part of the country, in the northern Nigeria, where much of the media are absent. And if we are absent, then what we get will be either half-truth or no truth at all.
Accurate information comes out very slowly. And the problem is that we have inaccurate information which is coming out initially. And we all know that what people hear first is what they'll remember. So if you have a figure such as 2,000 being bandied around, that's the figure that will remain, as opposed to the official figure which was released by the Nigerian military, which was around 150.
And you also remember that Nigerian journalists are not among the best paid, even in West Africa. Nigerian journalists don't have insurance. If a journalist dies while covering anything, in our local parlance here, we will say that he is on his own. That is OYO, on your own. And Boko Haram is not your regular army. They delight in killing journalists. They have attacked media houses. They have killed journalists. So nobody wants to stay there.
4 Nigerian journalists have been killed since Boko Haram came to prominence 5 years ago. Only one of those deaths has been blamed on the militants, but Boko Haram did target the media in 2012 when it launched strikes on 3 newspapers: This Day, The Sun, and The Moment. The chilling effect of those attacks and the remoteness of the story partly explain the lack of domestic coverage. And like anywhere else, if the local media are not there to report, the international media, which depend on local journalists, suffer from a lack of facts as well.
I think a factor is our shrinking commitment to foreign journalism and to foreign correspondence as well. And I think Africa especially is hardest hit by that. So many media outlets are scaling back on their Africa coverage. We have a lot of media outlets that might have one person assigned to the entire West Africa region, or one person assigned to the entire continent.
How can they be stopped.
News organizations and other interested parties, aid workers and NGOs have tried to piece together the story from afar through technology and their powers of deduction. Amnesty International says it examined satellite images before calling the attack Boko Haram's deadliest yet. And when a local government official estimated the death toll at 2,000, that figure proved contentious and politically charged.
What people do is that they base their reportage on hearsay or on whatever somebody who was there was able to, to tell them. And some people say that the Nigerian army was trying to downplay on the figure so that they don't give the impression that Boko Haram is winning the war. But we can never be sure what really happened.
Not too long after those numbers came out, various members of Nigeria's incumbent political party immediately came out on social media to discredit those numbers and made it into a partisan issue, which is quite an unfortunate feature of how Boko Haram has been politicized in Nigeria.
And then, of course, we have an election going on. The ruling party is convinced that the opposition wants to make them look bad by all means, and that they will latch onto any bad news. So there is this distrust.
And a lack of hard information from on-the-ground reporting feeds the uncertainty and confusion. 9 months ago, when more than 200 schoolgirls in the town of Chibok were kidnapped by Boko Haram, President Jonathan did not speak publicly about the crisis for 2 weeks. The ensuing criticism did not end when the president insisted he had remained silent for fear of compromising the negotiations. And 2 months later, his government signed a $1.2 million contract with a public relations firm based in Washington, the primary objective of which was to change the media narrative on the Boko Haram story. And a government clearly concerned with the narrative and its image last year is now less than a month away from national elections, which threaten to preoccupy politicians and the reporters covering them.
The media is concerned about the elections more than they're concerned about anything else going on in Nigeria right now. The politicians are concerned about winning the elections. Everybody who has a stake in who wins the election is concerned. So these are issues that are being magnified in the minds of Nigerians more than anything else happening in, according to some people, some remote corner of our country. Because people see it as some faraway place.
And a problem that we have here in Nigeria also is skepticism. Many people didn't even believe that the Chibok girls had gone missing. So there's definitely a large divide amongst Nigerians here, and that comes from political divides, that comes from religious divides, that comes from cultural divides in a country of over 170 million people.
The fighting in Nigeria is a big story, and when it fails to attract the kind of coverage its importance merits, there is a reflexive blaming of the international media and accusations of double editorial standards. Look more closely at what's behind that lack of ink or airtime, though, and you will find that Nigeria's coverage problem starts at home.
Whether the world paid attention to Nigeria or not is not really my concern. I'm more concerned about the fact that right here, we're not as bothered as we should be. I'm more concerned about the fact that our own media doesn't think it's important enough to make this headline news. They would rather report what some politician has said and what he has promised to do that politicians have promised over the past 10 years.
Who do we blame for that? Are we going to blame the media organizations who are not based there for not sending their reporters to come and cover Baga for us? Or are we going to blame ourselves for not going out there ourselves? They lack the resources. They lack the support. But wait a minute. What did our own government do when Baga happened? I'm going to be silent for 1 second. That's what they did. They were silent. And how do you cover silence? How do they expect our journalists to cover silence?
On the download this week, our viewers on the difficulty of covering the Boko Haram story in Nigeria.
One of the reasons the massacre was downplayed in the Western media, it's part of a broader problem that the Western media has when depicting news from Africa in particular. So often the case is that the only narrative it's familiar with when it comes to Africa is that of violence and destruction. When events like those that happen at Baga take place, I think there's almost a sense of fatigue in that, how can it provide a fresh take on something that seems so familiar?
We saw what happened in Paris, 70 people died. There was that global sentiment of sympathy. compared to Nigeria, where you had at least 150 or even 2,000 people passed away, there was that international neglect by the media. And we know why. There's still that sentiment that is anti-African racial formation, anti-African blackness.
Other media stories that are on our radar this week: the partnership between NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden and the UK's Guardian newspaper continues to make headlines. The latest involving British security agency GCHQ and the surveillance of journalists. The report, based on a new batch of Snowden documents, contends that in 2008, GCHQ scooped up to 70,000 bulk emails of journalists working for several major media organizations, including The Guardian, the BBC, Reuters, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Le Monde. The emails included editorial discussions and were accessed, according to The Guardian, as part of a test exercise by the agency. The Guardian also reported it had obtained a classified document written for British military intelligence personnel that described reporters representing all types of news media represent a potential threat to security. A spokesperson for GCHQ told The Guardian that all of GCHQ's work is carried out in accordance with a strict legal and policy framework which ensures that our activities are authorized, necessary, and proportionate. The news out of Paris after the Charlie Hebdo shootings was bad enough before Fox News brought its unique take to the story. Now the mayor says the city plans to sue the American news channel. Fox guest Steve Emerson, who Fox described as a terrorism expert, told viewers that Paris has areas that are completely Muslim and off-limits, no-go zones, as he put it, for non-Muslims. Emerson said the same thing about all of Birmingham, which is Britain's second most populous city, and the Fox anchor he was talking to took what Emerson said as read.
There are actual cities like Birmingham that are totally Muslim, where non-Muslims just simply don't go in. And parts of
Emerson later apologized. He was mildly roasted by British journalists, but never really explained how a terrorism expert could get it so spectacularly wrong on non-existent no-go zones. In an interview with CNN, Anne Hidalgo, the mayor of Paris, said that litigation is warranted because the city's image and honor had been prejudiced. Birmingham says it has no plans to sue. A city councillor there said the comments about Birmingham were a bit bonkers. We said so. Fox News corrected them. We've all moved on. End of story. Not quite. Michael Clemente, the executive vice president of Fox News, said we empathize with the citizens of France as they go through a healing process. However, we find the mayor's comments regarding a lawsuit misplaced. In other words, don't go there. Jim Clancy, one of CNN's longest-serving correspondents, is the latest prominent journalist to bite the dust after an exchange of opinions on Twitter. The tweets had to do with the Charlie Hebdo story, and Clancy got into it with someone named Oren Kessler, a research assistant with a Washington-based think tank known for its strong pro-Israel views. Clancy used the word hasbara, which in Hebrew translates to explanation, but is code for activists trying to portray Israel positively, lobbyists, PR types, and politicians included. Clancy, who spent 34 years at CNN, went after his young critic. Get a grip, Junior. You and the Hasbara team need to pick on some cripple on the edge of the herd. Clancy's next memorable piece of writing came a week and a half later in his resignation letter. The time has come to say farewell. It has been my honor to work alongside all of you for all these years. Jim Clancy is the second high-profile CNNer to commit Twittercide. Octavia Nasser was the network's chief Middle East correspondent when she was fired in 2010 after a controversial tweet about a Hezbollah cleric. Over the years here at The Listening Post, we've examined the work of cartoonists and satirists from around the world. This week, we thought it would be worth checking in with some of them in the wake of the Charlie Hebdo story. From South Africa, Jonathan Shapiro, known as Zapiro, who's been a thorn in the side of governments there going back to the apartheid era. In Chile, a country still coming to terms with its dictatorial past, Patricio Fernandez edits The Clinic, a magazine that goes where the mainstream media dare not go, respecting no taboos. In Spain, the public has warmed to the jaundiced eye of Mongolia and the cartoons of Dario Adanti. The publication takes aim at the monarchy, politicians, and, if necessary, the media. And there's Mark Fiore, the US-based cartoonist, was the first online animator to win a Pulitzer Prize in 2010 for his biting critiques of the US administration. We asked all of them what the attack on Charlie Hebdo means for satire, for free speech, and for the work they do.
Nosotros declaramos Je suis Charlie porque...
We declared Je suis Charlie because it's important to stand alongside any victim of violence. Not only are we Charlie Hebdo, We are also the victims in Nigeria and the victims in a lot of other countries which are suffering great acts of violence and terrorism, not only from the jihadist movement, but also from Western countries.
De países de Occidente.
I think that anyone who dedicates himself to humour and to independent journalism, you cannot help sharing the pain and the horror caused by such an attack. In this situation, you don't need to like Charlie Hebdo for you to say, "Je suis Charlie."
While we may not necessarily do cartoons like they are doing, we support their right to do those cartoons. So yes, I definitely stand by saying "Je suis Charlie." If Charlie Hebdo had not been attacked, I wouldn't identify with them in the same way I don't really identify with, Mad Magazine or certain comic books. You can still be a cartoonist and have different genres and different styles of cartoons, but once someone is attacked, it's kind of all for one and one for all when it comes to cartoons and free speech.
For me, freedom of expression is anything that does not incite someone to go out and hurt or kill. That freedom of expression should be allowed, even if there are some people who use that freedom of expression to say things that I really don't like, things that I might consider even racist or sexist or anti-Semitic or Islamophobic or anti-Christian or whatever. But I want to twist it on its head, because what happens is that I feel that the incitement to violence actually comes from the politicians, the political groups, the religious groups. I think religion gets a pretty free ride in society, and I feel like I should have the right to publish things, and I would try not to do ones that I think are gratuitously insulting.
Do limits exist at our magazine, The Clinic? There are things that we do not laugh at, but that's not because we put limits on ourselves, but because we do not subscribe to the joke. To me, it does not seem fair to make fun of a weak person. I prefer to make fun of a strong one. I don't want to make fun of a person whose human rights have been abused. I wouldn't dream of making a mockery of the disappeared, but I would not be prepared to ban it.
There are no limits to free speech. You should be able to say whatever you want. When I look at who I would defend, I would defend the Ku Klux Klan to march. That's something in the United States that has definitely had an awful history, but even though I don't agree with them and I despise them and everything they stand for, I feel idiots should be able to say what they want.
One of the problems about being a cartoonist is that sometimes people expect us to include every single issue in every single cartoon. So if somebody says to me that the pen versus the sword is inappropriate here, I don't think that's the case. I think the pen versus the sword is perfectly appropriate. On the other hand, as a cartoonist, I want to be looked at in terms of the continuum of my work. So I personally have done many, many cartoons criticizing Western violence against many people in the Middle East. But you can't put every single thing into every cartoon. And so what happens is that people will judge a particular cartoon and say, well, that cartoon is leaving out a big issue. Perhaps it is, but hopefully you're going to pick that up in another cartoon.
Nosotros tenemos que seguir peleando en Europa por la libertad de expresión aquí.
We in Europe are actually fighting for freedom of expression ourselves, because it's being chipped away at by our governments. This is why it irritates me when they try saying Europe represents civilization and the rest are barbarians. Which Europe are we talking about? The terrorist who killed over 100 people in Norway was European, and according to him, he was defending European values. Which Europe are we talking about? Voltaire's or Hitler's? So we need to avoid polarizing the discussion. We should avoid criminalizing the Arab world and Islam, because the jihadists are a very small minority who, if they do have any power, it's because they are financed by those kingdoms which, at the same time, are friends with the West, with whom the West does business. I think that I understand why they had depicted the Prophet on their cover again. I understand it because I think, in the light of something so brutal as the murder, their colleagues felt the need to say that if they are not going to let us do this, then we are going to do it again. I also understand this offends a large part of the French Muslim population.
musulmana.
I mean, that's exactly what I would have done if I was in their situation. And, I mean, and it fits perfectly with their style and with what they've been saying all along. So, yeah, if I was part of Charlie Hebdo, I would definitely run with that cover. And to me, outside of the blasphemy angle, I think it's a very tame, gentle cover, and it's very moving in some ways. But yes, if you're offended by seeing the image at all, that's going to cause problems. Just remember, that offense does not have to translate into death. I think that's what people forget.
Me parece que el mensaje más importante de la portada y lo que yo rescato.
I think the most important message on that cover, and what seems commendable to me, is the phrase that they are all forgiven. I understand it with a double meaning. I understand that on the one hand, God, whichever God it is, if he really is that magnanimous person that you believe him to be, forgiveness must be one of his greatest values. And I understood that their message was that God certainly forgave all the cartoonists who could be considered as heretics, and at the same time that they themselves forgive the act of madness of killing someone. And it also seemed to me as being another act of aggression. But then again, it was a call for peace, a warning against radicalizing the European narrative against the Arab world. Humor is ambiguous. It's so synthetic, there can be several interpretations.
Puede tener varias lecturas.
Este género va a seguir vivo por los siglos de los siglos.
This genre will stay alive for centuries to come. It will go through moments like this one right now, as it has always happened since the times of the Roman satirist Juvenal. And it will continue to emerge everywhere, because in some way it's the strength of reason opposed to the power of faith. Satire is a skeptic. It's the bad boy, not sweet and admirable and loving, but the opposite. It sees the worst in human beings and relishes our weaknesses and frailties. That's going to stay.
Y en nuestra flaqueza, y eso va a seguir.
I think there are two things happening. They're almost going in opposite directions. On the one hand, you have this phenomenal group solidarity, which has happened out of the Je suis Charlie movement. And I really love that. On the other hand, the individual cartoonist or satirist or editor or publisher is going to feel that difficulty of exactly how far to go right now or in the next while.
No, yo no creo que a la profesión le cambie.
I don't think my trade will change in its way of thinking. Let's not forget that there are humorists of all political ideologies. There's not only left-wing satire like ours. There are right-wing publications too. At Mongolia, we have always considered that satire was a way to attack the powers that be. What we do think is that, given the type of pressures we are subjected to here in Spain, from religious, financial, or political power, we will never forget that those very same people who try silencing our right to say what we want were the very people supporting freedom of expression during this event.
Apoyaron la libertad de expresión en este caso.
Sticking with the same theme, cartoonists and Charlie Hebdo, how could a cartoonist not pick up a pen, a pencil, or a brush and try to capture the gist of this story in a single panel? We've picked 5 cartoons that we feel get to the heart of a multi-layered story that's about freedom of expression, politics, different cultures, the power of images, and the way those images are seen and then used. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.